Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this first seminar in our TAPAS seminar series. I think this is our fourth series of seminars, and it's good to see a good turnout. So we have 42 of us here, so that's excellent. So thank you all for joining. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Linden. I'm based at the University of Cambridge, and I'm the principal investigator of TAPAS. As I'm sure most of you know, TAPAS is a network funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, part of their Clean Air initiative. And it's a network bringing together people who are interested in air pollution and in the context of schools, and in particular, looking at the interaction between indoor air pollution and outdoor air pollution and the impacts on children in particular. And we have a range of activities that some of you have participated in, and if you want further information, you can get in touch with us through Kat, who's also on the call, and who will pass on further information for you about our activities. But for today, it's just a pleasure for me to introduce Gary Fuller. So Gary is our speaker today. He's one of the 3 UKRI Clean Air champions. He works at Imperial College London, and his interests are on urban air pollution and how it is evolving and affecting us, our health and well-being. And he also writes to the Guardian newspaper, which I think is an excellent journal. So very good. So we're very pleased to have you, Gary, and I'm going to just hand over to you. Before I do that, just a bit of housekeeping. Please turn your cameras off and put yourselves on mute while Gary is speaking. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll deal with those at the end of the presentation. So apart from that, over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you both, Paul and Kat, for inviting me along to talk today, to give this first seminar in your new series. We were discussing what would be a good topic, so I thought it was interesting to focus on some of the opportunities to improve air pollution around schools and some of the things that I've come across and schemes. So hopefully we can tour some of the evidence here and how some of these things have been put into practice. I also wanted to spend a couple of minutes and talk about the Clean Air Champions programme for the next 3 years. And it's good for me to be able to talk to all the researchers across the SPF. So it's great to see so many faces here. But also, we're very keen as champions to spread the word about the SPF far wider than within the SPF. So anyway, I'm going to do these in reverse. I'm going to do a couple of slides on the champions, and then I'm going to talk much more about air pollution around schools. So firstly, as Paul said, TAPAS is funded as part of the Clean Air programme, and this is a strategic priorities fund initiative that draws together money from and funding and research sort of evidence needs from everyone who's represented with a logo here. So I won't name check them all. We've had wave 1, and those projects are running at the moment, and they're reaching their end over the next year or so to be producing results. And we are very much now in the midst of wave 2, of which TAPAS is part of, and we have a slightly different priority for wave 2, which includes a lot more work on the indoor-outdoor continuum. As part of the Clean Air Champions, there are 3 of us who are funded on around a day a week each, if you like, to be ambassadors for the programme. Our role, I think, I can see on 3 levels. 1, to connect together everyone that's working within the SPF so that your outputs are bigger than the, sum of the parts. The other is to reach out slightly further into the broader air pollution and research communities to connect them to the SPF to try to really create a world-class air quality research community in the UK and beyond. And lastly, there is another role, I suppose, to connect all of that to the wider stakeholders, including government. So our three champions are led by Professor Stephen Holgate. There's been some changes to the team in this, our second wave. So we now have Suzanne Bartington from the University of Birmingham, who's has a great deal of interest and expertise in air pollution and public health, and myself very much from the sort of atmospheric science angle. We're also being joined in this second wave by Noel Nelson from the Met Office, and I'm sure she's known well to many of you here, Sarah Muller, who's joining us as a knowledge exchange in a knowledge exchange role, as a knowledge exchange champion later on in the programme. I wanted just briefly to say about a couple of things about some of the different initiatives. So just a couple of slides on things that we're going to be doing for Wave 2, so over the next 3 years. First is that there's going to be some increased investment in early and mid-career researchers. So there's a number of things that are opportunities for early and mid-career researchers. The first is our Clean Air Research Futures group. And this is a group whereby we're looking, a small group that we're looking at the future research challenges, because let's face it, it's the early and mid-career researchers that will be doing these in 10 years' time. We've looked at small sensors, pathways to WHO guidelines, tracking inequalities and vulnerabilities. And so there's a set of themes, and we're trying to do around 3 of these a year. We're also trying to introduce media and communications training, since I really think the best advocates for the science that we're all doing across the programme are the people that are doing the science themselves. So all of your universities and institutions will do media training, but I don't really think, having been on far too many of these things myself, I don't think they really fully equip you for many of the interactions with the media, and also to have your own voice out there, be it in blogs, web pages, and writing. So we're going to bring together a course to put that together, and we're signing up some real life journalists. At the moment, I've got Damon Carrington, who you might know from the journal that Paul mentioned earlier, and hopefully we're going to get a couple more. And then finally, there's a small travel bursary that we're setting up to allow greater exchange, so physical exchange, as we open out between the different projects. The other thing I wanted to talk about was our knowledge exchange work. So Sarah Muller will be joining us as a new knowledge exchange champion. And later on in our 3 years, she'll be working with us more fully as each of the projects gradually mature to produce results. And she'll be joined by a part-time knowledge exchange fellow. Their work will be focused a great deal on connecting the SPF projects with government. And Sarah's already held 1 day with our Wave 1 projects and DEFRA. We're also setting up a knowledge exchange group, and the whole idea here is we're going to bring in about a dozen people from allied fields around air pollution, be it in healthcare, climate, and importantly, that have a good policy interface. And the whole idea is this will be a sounding board for those of you that are doing research within the SPF, so that they can help you amplify the impact of your work, and particularly the policy impact of your work, and they themselves will act as ambassadors for the SPF findings going forward. There's a series of roundtables and workshops that we're pulling together as well. We've done previous ones on toxicology, health and air quality data, and bringing these together. Flame retardants is another group, and we've developed our next theme that we're taking forward is one working closely with TAPAS and with Breathing City, which is developing ideas for an indoor air quality observatory, and to see if we can get some sort of consensus view on this that can be taken to funders and to take that forward. But for us to do our job on knowledge exchange, it's vitally important that we know what you're doing. And I know you all report to the funders but we don't get to see those reports since we're not part of the funding process. We're a project like you that works as part of the SPF. So we need to know about your findings. We need to know about your papers so that we can take them out there and represent your work in the wider community and connections we are bringing forward. I'll just show you 3 things that have emerged from the SPF work so far. As you can see, examples of the sort of things that can be taken forward. The first one comes from Anticipate, one of our Wave 1 projects, and this is about looking at our transport decarbonisation in a systems manner. And this is like looking at all of the interconnected links between the electric mobility that seems to be coming our way, human health and environment, what things will be good, what things can be bad, what trade-offs are there, and how can we integrate that into transport policy making. And I really encourage you, slides to be circulated around afterwards, go and have a delve, and you can actually online play with their systems map yourself. The second one comes from Innovate UK, and there are some genuine inventions going on as part of the SPF. This one tackles the near impossible challenge, it seems, of reducing tyre wear. And here we've been working with a company that's setting up sensors that are already in production that can be stuck on the wheels of vehicles to tell the drivers and to tell their maintenance depots that their wheels are out of line. And you'd be surprised to know that wheel alignment is not checked as part of yearly MOTs on cars and small vehicles. And it has a massive impact on fuel economy, on tyre wear, and therefore CO2 and particle pollution. And hopefully this device, if it can be rolled out, will help reduce that by feeding back to people. Last one I wanted to mention comes from Duchems, which is one of the Met Office projects, and you'll be all well aware of the issues to do with what really comes out of the back of vehicles through the exhaust when they're used in the real world, and the VW and NO2 diesel scandals. And the current emission factors, which I'll show you there just in the top 2, for NOx and NO2, we've got measured versus model concentration fields, and you can see that pretty much the accepted emission factors called COPA underestimate the real world quite a lot. So people producing models have to correct this, but that means they get the right answers for the wrong reasons, which means that when they're used in the policy process going forward, they're really not optimal for this. So through this project, there's been developed a new set of emission factors which deal a lot more differently with city driving conditions and can remove a lot of these biases. So there's 3 examples that I've cherry picked from the SPF as examples of the way in which there are real outputs coming from this that we're able to take to government and other stakeholders. So for instance, if these are taken forward in government policy, it will reshape the way we're managing NO2. So it's a plea really, participate in the things that we do with you, and also to tell us about the research you're bringing forward. So more substantially, I wanted to move on to the second part, which is this idea of opportunities to improve air pollution around schools. When thinking of what to say here, I was brought to PM 2.5 and the current debate that's been going on with the UK Environment Act, and there's a similar one going on within the EU. It's attracted a lot of media attention, and you can see some of the news items that have come from it here. But government is currently consulting and delayed its response, as you'll have seen in the news as well, on a proposal to take the World Health Organization guidelines that were set in 2005 and enshrine them in UK law 35 years later in 2040. And also, less debated here is an objective going forward to reduce PM 2.5 exposure across the whole of, well, actually it's England, but anyway, as an average by 35%. And a lot of things are focused on the WHO guideline and headline bit here, And I don't think we've had enough focus really on this exposure reduction concept, which is also being debated quite heavily in the EU. So what is this? I think really overall behind this, I'd like to say that I think there's a real urgent need within the way that we're managing air pollution to move forward with the evidence that we're using. A lot of the science of the late 1990s and early 2000s taught us very much that there was no real threshold for zero effects for PM 2.5. And this was debated heavily at an EU level. And a lot comes from evidence from the 1990s, such as the 6 city study shown here, where you can see the relationship between fine particle exposure and rate ratios for early mortality, with no evidence of threshold here at all. Things went down to their lowest concentrations. So responding to this, a lot of thinking was done, a lot in the UK, considerably amount by one of our former champions, Martin Williams, who sadly no longer here with us, saying that it would be more efficacious from a public health perspective to reduce air pollution everywhere and for everyone, rather than chasing those points that are the worst places that exceed the limit value. And that was incorporated into the current EU directive and lays within UK law as well. And this exposure reduction idea, you know, it's very utilitarian. It aims to reduce average exposure. But that was the science of then. So what should we do with the science of now? What's happened in between? I think really some of the things that have emerged in between is growing evidence that air pollution exposure is impacting on early life. And I'll just put forward 4 pieces of information here. And many of you will know this territory far better than me. The first is the Royal College of Physicians report that Steve Holgate led and I was part of, which looked at the lifelong impact of air pollution. And this really had a focus on children and the harm from air pollution exposure throughout the life course. The second one is work done in London with a group of London universities. Well, I was briefly I'm minorly in the co-authors here, but a massive team of people went out and tested the lung function of children in East London schools. And what they found, looking over almost 10 years of tests that were done, was that the children that are living in the most polluted places are growing smaller lungs. And this lung decrement is about the volume of 2 hens' eggs. We don't really know what effect that has on the children, but it raises the question of, are we storing up a legacy of ill health that may affect us in the future? And many of you, I'm sure will think of your grandparents and parents' generation and how they get flu and other illnesses at the end of life, and the difficulties that respiratory illnesses cause still. So if you enter that period with smaller lungs, are we storing up a legacy? And lastly, much more contemporaneous, is this year's report from the HEI, where they did a lot of systematic review and meta-analysis and looked at transport, air pollution from transport. And there many things were highlighted, including onset of asthma in children due to roadside air pollution exposure. So this brings us to the question with exposure reduction. Rather than reducing air pollution evenly everywhere as an average, can we actually do better from a public health perspective, and can we do better from the health of our population? I'm really grateful to my colleague Ben at Imperial and his team, and they've been doing a number of projects which you might have seen with backpacks on kids and on children at school. And Ben's kindly supplied me this data, and it raises a really important question of, if we want to reduce children's exposure to air pollution, where should we do it? And you've got to say, at school, which is the middle part of the day, is often when children are in the least polluted environments that they encounter. But there's a buffer either side when children are travelling to and from school, before they get into their home environment. So you could argue that given that children are concentrated in one place at a school, we could do a lot in terms of public health gain by focusing on that exposure at school. And even more, if we can focus on that, the exposure in the areas around school where children travel, can we gain more from that as well? So this really begs the question, I think, of the current air quality management that we have looks at things on quite a wide city level, and can this be optimized? Is there opportunity to optimize this for, let's say, areas around schools? Now, one thing that is clear, and I don't think we often think about it, is that air pollution management that's done across cities, that's done nationally, doesn't affect everywhere evenly. This is some work I did with my colleague, Anna Font. And if I draw your attention to the left-hand side, this is a forest plot. And what we're showing here on the bottom is the rate of change of nitrogen dioxide. And what all of these locations, you don't certainly have to read them, are roads in London. And this dotted line that rises through the middle is 0. So everything that's on the right-hand side of the line is getting worse. Everything on the left-hand side is getting better. And this covers about 4 or 5 years from about 2010 onwards. And I put this up here to show the tremendous heterogeneity. We have some places in London during this time when the mayor is pushing forward policies where nitrogen dioxide alongside roads was deteriorating. And we have other places, by contrast, that are improving very rapidly. Now, what we did in this paper is we looked at some of the obvious predictors of this. You can see in the middle panel, we have trend or change of vehicle numbers against the change of nitrogen dioxide. And you can see that it's not really clear that it is just a simple case of more vehicles in one place, or increase or decrease of vehicles in one place or another. One thing we did find that came out quite clearly is the change in the number of buses and coaches that were on particular roads affected the NOx concentration. You can see this quite neat relationship in the lower panel. I mean, this is London. London, everyone thinks, if you don't live in London, you think of it as mainly tube dominated. In reality, the main public transport mode in London is buses, with patronage far greater, almost twice the patronage of most other cities in the UK. So buses here were coming out as really quite a major factor. We did a second study where we looked at something similar, looking at rates of change in cities in London and Paris simultaneously over a slightly longer time period. And if I draw your attention to the NO2 one in the left-hand side, we have the concentration along the bottom in 2010, and then the right-hand axis is the rate of change. And you can see there are a number of places that started in 2010 with some horrendous nitrogen dioxide concentrations. The annual mean limit value is 40. We had concentrations of around 180. And you can see that these are the places that are having the greatest rate of improvement. And if you look here up in the top corner, you can see there's places with moderate concentrations where the policies have been less focused. And what this is really showing us here is that some of the mayor's policies were actually focusing in the most polluted places and were being quite efficacious. So it shows that this focus is greater. I won't talk so much about the PM10 and PM2.5. You can check out the paper. So I talked about buses. And all of these trends, by the way, were before the ultra low emission zone, so bear that in mind. So buses came out quite a lot in this research. So it begs the question of, can we actually focus, if we were to focus on air pollution on the roads around schools, are there really, bespoke and targeted measures that can be taken? And certainly from the evidence that we've showed, yes, there is a lot of heterogeneity. If we can make the most improving places the ones around schools, then perhaps that can give us most long-term public health benefit. You've got to say about how you can do this. And one of the things before the rollout of the ultra low emission zone was targeted improvement of buses in London. So buses were upgraded to the latest Euro standards, and some of them also were retrofitted. And I'm showing a small study here that we did along one of the most polluted roads in South London, quite close to Brixton Academy, if you've been there. So here we have nitrogen dioxide concentrations, and each of these vertical lines shows the introduction of more and more buses along this road that are Euro 6. So as new buses were introduced, you can see that concentrations fell really markedly. We knocked off from 150 to 100 micrograms per cubic meter, which is a massive change in a very short period. The retrofitted ones that came in with these blue lines seem to have less effect, but it actually shows that it is possible to have a geographical targeting along roads in specific areas to improve air pollution. So less targeted, of course, there is the success of London's ultra low emission zone. This has been assessed by the Mayor's office, but I reviewed some of the work they did as part of this assessment. And here we can see the assessment for the first part of the ultra low emission zone. That only affects, if you're not familiar with it, the small central area of London. And the things to look at are the top two lines. The red line is the nitrogen dioxide concentration along roads in central London, and you can see this really, really sharp fall. What would have happened otherwise? So one of the things we introduced into this was a counterfactual, and our counterfactual, which I could discuss later if you wanted to go through in questions, what would have happened if we didn't have this policy, is the green line. And you can see a very large impact. So I think it goes to show that it is possible to have targeted actions in areas that can have really large impacts on localized concentrations, especially nitrogen dioxide. The ultra low emission zone is, of course, expanding out, and as it does so, it's going to be covering areas with a lot more schools in it, and so that in itself may have quite an impact on air pollution in schools, around schools, and importantly on the journeys to school. I'm sure some of you will be a lot more familiar with this than I am, but the London Mayor, of course, had a set of school audits that were done looking at the opportunities to improve air pollution around London schools and looking at schools on an individual basis. I put up a summary of these measures that comes from a presentation by WSP. And you can see that they fall into different areas. We have highways measures like anti-idling, smoothing traffic flows and so forth. We have parking ones and things to do with the stopping of traffic. We have things that could be done on school sites, including staff car parking, green screens, which I'll come to in a minute, as well as things to do with school heating boilers, which I'll also touch on, and then behavioural measures as well with the school community. So we're almost spoiled for opportunities to improve air pollution around schools. The thing is, which of these are actually efficacious or not, or which ones should we prioritise, and which can be done within the constraints of a school site. One of the things I wanted to focus on, of course, is school streets. And I think these are absolutely brilliant. School streets are being rolled out quite a lot in the UK, but actually started in Italy, in the town of Bolzano. And I've put a link here, which you can see later and follow up yourself. There's a YouTube from an EU program that looks really quite dated, which is quite funny. But basically, in this town, they set up, they first did with school streets. So school streets, if you're not familiar, the program is that the street outside the school is closed for half an hour or so, school drop off, and when kids are picked up. These have spread really quite widely in the UK, first in Scotland, then in London, and then elsewhere. And I think there's so many opportunities from school streets that go way beyond in co-benefits, beyond air pollution. We have, by encouraging different modes of transport to school, you can't deliver your child to the school gate. Then we can benefit so much more in terms of carbon emissions. They were originally set up in Bolzano for safety, where they halved the accident rates for children going to school. They can also, what I really like about them, and I really encourage you, go along and find a school that has a school street and just watch it in action. So normally the road outside a school is a problem for the school. You'll find these fences, you can just see on the left-hand side of this photograph here, outside the school gates to corral the children, almost like zoo animals behind the fence. But when the school street is introduced, it changes what essentially is a problem for the school into an asset. So instantly the school community can flood outside, parents can talk to each other, children can play, and it turns it into a social space, which is really essential for binding together the school community. They are being rolled out in many other places. There's a really nice program that's much more, unless officially, with parents actually taking their own action in the Netherlands, called Café Filter, which is really good initiative, and these are being spread out further. They're being accepted with quite a lot of enthusiasm. The top left-hand corner, I was talking just before this to the local councillor who is responsible for this one in my home city of Brighton. And you can see there, just kids flood out into the road and are able to use it as an asset. Has been one appraisal of these using small sensors, and I'm unsure really how well small sensors actually work in these conditions, because many of these school streets are actually done on really quiet roads. No one's actually closed down a major trunk road to allow the children to go to school. They're generally on quieter streets. But this study by air quality consultants found some really nice improvements in nitrogen dioxide alongside 16 schools. So decreases of about 23%, which is, not to be sniffed at. That's really, really quite significant. So, of course, should we go further? Should we be trying to create zones around schools that exist permanently, not just at the school drop-off and pick-up times, but for the times that children are in school, to reduce their exposure there? And there are some great examples of these in things like low-traffic neighbourhoods, and you can see some illustrations there excuse me, on the left-hand side, or things that can be done on a much more street-by-street basis. I really like some of the work that's been done there in the centre in Waltham Forest, around saying, well, there's many problems we can solve together. That of sustainable drainage and urban flooding is really, really important, as well as urban biodiversity. So if we can green our streets, we can reduce traffic, and we can have many, many more co-benefits. So I think that, I would say, is really our first opportunity, is that around traffic, the optimization of policies that we have in a city to reduce air pollution, to focus on areas where children are exposed. And the second is really through things like school streets, and then to extend this to think about the areas around schools. This is not entirely straightforward, and there are many other challenges for schools in air pollution. So I wanted to take you briefly to Yerbury School, which is a primary school. So that's, up to 11 years old in North London. They've got a fantastic gate outside in ironwork that, really announces your arrival at the school. And the street in front of it is a school street. It's closed for 45 minutes twice a day to allow the children to be dropped at school. They've got solar panels on the roof. It's a fantastic school community. And in that school community, well, these are the children. And these are the children protesting. Because if you look round in the left-hand picture, you can see the fences of their playground, and a large distribution depot is proposed for the area just behind the fence that's on the right hand side, the metal fence there. And that is right up against the school playground. This is the playground for the nursery kids, for the youngest kids. And I'll show you in a moment just how close it is to the school buildings. If you want to find out a bit more about this, you can look up their campaign, which is called No Cardo. So you can, it doesn't take long to think about who is the people that are trying to build the distribution depot. But I encourage you to have a look, and if you want to, put some money in the tin. So this, the left-hand panel, is the school buildings. We're having some maintenance done, and on the right-hand side, of course, is the fence for the distribution vehicle, where heavy goods vehicles will be trundling outside, delivering stuff going to and from the distribution vehicle depot. And the distance between the nearest school window and the fence is about 2 meters. And you've really got to ask, is this what we should be allowing next to our schools? This school community, and this is one of the things, it doesn't seem to be subject to planning laws or environmental impact assessment. And the school community have actually been to the High Court over this. And at the moment, they're trying to go to the planning inspectorate, since the developers, Ocado, oops, I've said it, are really adamant that they are going to build a massive distribution depot 2 odd meters from this windows. I think it's really summed up by the deputy head teacher who gave me a quote when I wrote a piece on this for The Guardian. He said, the 450 children at our school are obliged to come here each day and breathe the air, regardless of how clean it is. Children deserve to know the adults in their lives are caring for them and their future. And he was really big on this. Adults must show an example. And he said, the school street has showed the children how we can work together to improve the local environment. And this is totally undermined by the plans for the depot at the back of the building. And he's exactly right. In the balance of fairness, I also went to Ocado, and Ocado said, committed to having a positive impact on the local community, this will be the greenest and quietest grocery facility in the UK. 2.5 meters, 2 meters from the classroom of the school. We will install a living wall along the boundary. And so there we are. It brings me very nicely, as I say, go and check out their campaign if you're interested to learn a little bit more. But it asks an important question of, it's not just the roads around the schools that cause air pollution. And if we are to focus on air pollution around schools, is there also a good case for focusing on the buildings, the developments, the factories, the industry that surrounds schools as well? And I think there is, and I think this speaks for itself. Ocado mentioned green walls. I think these are fantastic to make an environment more attractive, to encourage us outside, to do so many things actively, and to socialize actively outside. I think they're absolutely brilliant in terms of decoration and greening our urban environment. There's 2 examples there on the right hand side of schools of green walls that have been attached to educational establishments that really improve the outdoor environment. On the right hand side, there is a green wall which is just doing absolutely nothing, as you can see with the open windows, protect the children that are inside here from the air pollution from the traffic. This one's actually quite close to Victoria Station. I cycle past it every day that I go into work, and the green wall died over the summer in the drought because no one looked after it. But I really think that it's not really the solution. I think there's so many other things we can do that will have far greater co-benefits, as we've discussed. One of the other things that it's been really nice to do as Air Quality Champion is start to join things together. And I was talking to Kat about this by email. There's been the Ask About Asthma campaign done this year. And part of this, we discovered that the asthma toolkits that are done for asthma-friendly schools by the NHS, mostly in London, make almost no mention of air pollution. So hopefully next year's ones, when they come out, will actually have a lot of things that school communities can do going forward. And you can hear me chatting as part of this with Deputy Mayor Shirley Rodriguez if you want to follow up on the links. The next one, I'm bringing this to more or less a close. School heating systems. These are flagged up in the Mayor's toolkit, and here they use the replacement of rather aging gas boilers with heat pumps, which I'm sure will be nice for many school communities if they can afford it. One that concerns me quite a bit more is the amount of biomass boilers that have been installed in schools. You can see this proud picture on the left-hand side of children opening their new biomass boiler. And there's been a huge number of incentive schemes that have ended up incentivizing effectively wood chip burners in schools. And I list some of these here. Some brilliant market intelligence, thanks to Neil Harrison, who's a man who's completely dedicated to his profession. He's very good. But the point is that there are a lot of schools on county-wide basis that have been done, mostly in Scotland, but throughout the UK, that have wood chip boilers. And there's some important questions, I think, about how well these have been installed and how well they're operated, since they're not really simple things to run. So I just show this one illustration. We've been trying to look on a street-by-street basis in London at small areas to try and determine whether there's air pollution hotspots in winter from people burning wood. And my colleagues Andrew and John have been out walking the streets with backpack sensors. One of the ones we did actually quite close to Yerbury School in North London showed really some quite unexpected results. And there's 2 walks that were done by people, and you could find that each of them found this really quite large peak in black carbon concentration, and one that we really didn't expect. When we actually followed through, because these things were done at night time, followed through into the areas in the daytime, we found this pellet burner that had been installed in a sports pavilion in a park. And I put this here as an example of the fact that if pellet boilers are badly installed and perhaps badly run and badly maintained, they take a lot of TLC, then they can give rise to some really quite serious concentrations. And we're seeing quite a lot in terms of, tens of micrograms per cubic meter that would be of PM10, PM 2.5 in the hundreds of meters around this. So that's about the scale of a school playground. So summing up, I think it's time that we need to be, the evidence shows that it's time that we need to be managing our air pollution based on the science of today and not the science of the 20th century. The main point here, relevant to this, and there's lots of other reasons why we need to update our science evidence that goes into air pollution policy. But here, the one I'm really citing is the health evidence that I think suggests that we should optimize our air pollution policies to reduce exposure for children. Yeah. And here I've talked about some of the ways in which we may be able to do this if we can explore some of the heterogeneity in the response of our streets to kind of city-wide policies. We've got things like school streets, zones around schools, where we reduce transport or road transport, and that could bring about a huge number of co-benefits. I've shown here about low emission zones, and these can be applied in a local area and they can work. And I raised the question about whether we need to be protecting the areas around schools for other types of development. And a real plea here from the people who are networked out here, if there's biomass boilers in schools, I think they really need to be checked quite neatly. The Yerbury School one also raises another point about this depot, and there are many examples of developments and things that happen around schools whereby our laws don't entirely cover every circumstance. So it really begs the question, if we had a right to a healthy environment or a right to clean air that might protect children's exposures, then this will be a set of principles that could be applied in those circumstances where the current laws hadn't really been framed to apply. And lastly, from the champion's perspective, a reminder from the bit at the start saying, please, please, please tell us about all of the impactful results and papers that you're doing from the SPF. So my last slide, which will go around, is just about how to contact me. So I'll stop talking at that point, open the floor to questions, and just say thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. Very fascinating talk and lots of interesting ideas here. I do have some questions in the chat. So the first, and I'll go through them. So the first one is that I can find is from Pete Knapp, who asks,
Yes.
do you know if there's progress on low-cost real-time NOx sensors?
I think you mean nitrogen dioxide, really, rather than NOx.
Yeah, well,
I think
either, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, with the small sensors, it's really difficult. They promise so much, but in reality, they're very hard to actually deploy in a quantified, in a way to help with quantification. There are a huge number of people who are using small sensors in a whole variety of studies, and I really wish we could find some way to harness their work to really directly affect policy. I asked just before COVID, I asked around sort of all of my contacts, and I said, can you find me an example of where small sensor and community sort of citizen science work has been directly taken into policy? And I could only find one example. And that came from a small village in Surrey, where a group of old age pensioners had actually got together and used diffusion tubes to prove to their local authority that the main road through their sort of town village was leading to breaches of the EU limit values. And the only reason the local authority took this on board was that they were helped by someone with expertise who ensured that the measurements were done exactly according to LAQM 16. And the local authority therefore had no option but to take along these results. So ways in which we can harness this enthusiasm and these technologies to directly influence policy, we desperately need. I think the best initiative I've seen in a little while is one that's coming from BSI. So that's our Standards Institute for those of you outside the UK. And that's trying to set up a publicly accessible standard to help people run these devices. So I don't think there's huge advances in the instrumentation, and there won't be, since they all just use the same basic science. So the advances are going to be within the post-processing. And if we can find accepted ways for people to use them in an optimized way, then I think that's how we're going to get better impact from them.
Yeah, there are a couple of, I'm not sure these are quite questions in the chat, but Mark Strong from Transport Initiatives has said that they've installed 30 air quality real-time sensors in Lambeth, and they're planning on another at 30 places other than schools. So, and I guess he was one, and Dave Pearson says Northampton is currently planning 10 air quality real-time sensors. And I guess the issue is, you know, how valuable do you think that is in this area?
So I was involved before I shift into the champions role in a massive project in London. Mark is, I know Mark from his work on transport, including lots of the things around schools, actually. But we took over the Breathe London network. And I think one of the biggest things that's come from this is not from the quantification or the new sources that we've necessarily found, or the more detailed knowledge we've gained and spatial distribution, but it's about connecting communities to the air pollution that is around them. And many of the sensors that we've put in have actually been in schools. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use sensors to raise awareness.
All right, thank you. Yeah, okay. And there's a bit back and forth about that in the chat. Excuse me, but I also have a question, and I think it's very interesting you raised this issue about localized initiatives and so on, and talk about school streets. And I just wonder if you have a feeling for what you mean by localized. I mean, is it good enough to close a street, and is it good enough to do it for half an hour, or, I mean, or, you know, would you be better benefits if you close down bigger areas, or is, you know, is it really trying to you know, how do you optimize that process? What I'm trying to say.
I think it's a really good question. And you know, how far should we go with these things, and should we be a lot bolder? Most of the pardon me, most of the school streets out there are really covering stretches of road that no more than, you know, 100, 200 meters long, and they're generally quite quiet roads anyway. But they still have a tremendous impact in that they give the school community space and safer space around schools that encourage not just people to connect with each other, but it can encourage active travel. I would like to see these initiatives going a lot further from schools. The area I live, not so far from Mark actually, where he makes his comments. My daughter, for instance, our primary school, we were the furthest on the catchment when she started there. That's 800 meters. So you don't necessarily have to go that far. But I'd like to see action being taken on some more major roads as well, because the school streets are only affecting the little side roads. And we need to be doing a lot more effort on the major roads that are outside so many schools. Travel along trunk roads in London, or probably whatever your home city, and you will pass schools. Right. So I think we need to be doing a lot more and on a bigger spatial scale.
Right. And a question in the chat from Guy from Comp Air says, do we know if there'll be legislation on PM 2.5 anytime soon?
Within the Environment Act, the government had to bring forward a number of environmental standards, and you'll have seen some of the news stories that they haven't brought these forward. And in terms of the time frame for doing so, I'm afraid I don't know. They've consulted on targets, and they haven't met their own time frame for response, and their legislative time frame to actually put a law in place. I know that they have had a great deal of consultation responses. Apart from that, I can't explain the delay anymore, apart possibly from the number of governments maybe we've had in the last few months.
Yeah. Henry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. It was a lovely talk. I just want to ask a question really in the context of sort of social equity, in terms of the efficiency of localized efforts versus national policy, and the potential risk that, you know, increased localized efforts actually, you know, it can exacerbate. I don't know if Chris Brown is on the call, but Chris does a lot of work in Bradford schools, visits lots of Bradford schools, and you know, very mixed degree of affluence, and he sort of always anecdotally says that he gets worse mobile signal when he's in affluent areas, because those affluent areas have been able to campaign against, you know, new mobile signals being built in their area. And your example of this, you know, no Cardo campaign was a really interesting one, and it seemed like they were running quite a successful campaign. And I just wondered, you know, to what extent was that reliant on them being able to raise funds, and that risks, you know, questions about these things tending to happen more, or being more successful in areas which are less able to raise the funds to argue against them.
I think you raised two questions there. One, thinking about the inequalities, and I would go further in thinking about perhaps the unequal vulnerabilities of people as well. You know, we can think about inequality in terms of not just air pollution exposure, but risk of harm, if you like, places where there may be high concentrations of children who have poor health. There are many people in this country that are living at the nexus of many different environmental and economic stressors. And I think our air pollution policies have been fairly blind to this so far. There's quite a movement with people within AQUEG who would really like us to be trying to put a spotlight on this and really see whether our policies, how they have mapped up. There's some really nice work done by Joe Barnes looking at the first decade of this century and nitrogen dioxide, and what she found was the and her colleagues, the disparity between the concentrations experienced by the richest and poorest communities actually increased in that 10-year period. We also find other things that, any city, I did a talk in my home city and I put up a map of inequalities. I think it was just, deprivation index and air pollution and vehicle ownership. And I live in a city where vehicle ownership is quite low. And it was just blatantly obvious that the people in the poorest areas owned the fewest numbers of vehicles and therefore made least contribution to the problem, but yet experienced most of the impacts. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here to look at our air pollution policies through different lenses, rather than going to the other part of your question where you talked about national measures. Yeah. So I think there's tremendous opportunity to optimize our national measures. So one way to optimize them may be to look at bringing them to focus, or what additional things can be done in areas where people are especially vulnerable, be it for, wealth inequalities or health inequalities or housing inequalities. There are so many people living, as I say, at the nexus of all of those. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for the optimization of policies. If you remember back, I don't think I'm screen sharing at the moment, but I showed about the heterogeneity of London's roads in their response to fairly blanket policies. And if we can apply fairly blanket policies to decrease air pollution and then tweak them so that these heterogeneities play out for us to protect the more vulnerable communities, then perhaps we've got a nice compromise, and the two agenda, the local and the sort of national or citywide, don't necessarily have to be in conflict.
Thanks very much. I'm conscious that it's now 2:00, and so I think we're going to have to close the discussion there. I'd just like to say thank you very much, Gary, for a fascinating and very kind of thought-provoking talk. You have managed to attract, I think, our record audience of 60 people to one of our seminars.
Brilliant. So thank you all for coming along.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for the 60 people who've tuned in. Please tune in again next week when we'll have, I hope, an equally fascinating second seminar in this series at 1:00 next Thursday. And just it remains for me to say again, thanks for everyone. If you want more information about Tapas, there's a link in the chat, how to get in touch with us, and we very much welcome any interactions you'd like to make. And with that, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.